The problem is Israel as a whole is in favor of ethnic cleansing. There was a poll, a really striking poll that came out. It was conducted by Penn State a few days ago of the Jewish Israeli population. And they found that 86% were in favor of ethnic cleansing Gaza, meaning, driving all Gazans out. 86%. So, any government that's going to come into power is going to be in favor of that. Now, amazingly, 56% of Jewish Israelis are in favor of ethnically cleansing Arab Israelis. In other words, the Palestinians that are Israeli citizens and constitute about 20% of the population there. They want to drive them out. So the majority of Jewish Israelis want, to drive their own fellow citizens out of the country. And then 47% were in favor of killing all Gazans in any territory that is captured by the IDF within Gaza. So just killing them all. So we're just talking about, we talk about these people like Chuck Schumer or whatever, try to frame it as like it's just a few bad apples, that we got to get rid of these guys like Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. But no, it's clear that, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, they're not really outliers. They use a certain kind of rhetoric that's not, it's not the kind of rhetoric that most Israelis would use, but they are essentially in favor of the same policies. That's what we're looking at. This is
that's wild,
right? This poll should have gotten a lot more attention. I mean, because again, you find that it's still so many people in the West, even the ones that are starting to be critical, they're still trying to defend the Israelis, and stopping short of using the word genocide. But the Israelis themselves, they're telling us, no, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. Again, it's just like anybody who's been paying attention has been hearing that poll. Still was something of a surprise to me, but it's not that much of a surprise because of the kind of statements that you're hearing from all, people across the spectrum. And then, to the credit of a few politicians, there's one guy who's the head of the Democrats party. There's a leftist party within Israel. He said, essentially, he didn't use the word genocide, but he described, he said clearly the Israelis are guilty of war crimes and they're killing babies as a hobby. He used this, which infuriated a lot of, the vast majority of Israelis, including his leftist supporters. They didn't want to hear that. Maybe it's not quite a hobby. He shouldn't have used that word, but they clearly are intentionally killing babies. There is a genocidal program, and that's what he was saying. And then there was, I think, a former IDF general that came out and said something very similar. This is a systematic, deliberate, attack on the civilian population of Gaza. And so so even there are some dissidents, there are kind of voices in the wilderness within Israel. But then you have, on the other side, that's what we're doing. And they're celebrating, they're supported by the polls. And this is happening in Israel. And then you get people trying to cover for them in the West. Say we can't be too critical of Israel. The Israelis themselves are just kind of coming out of the closet, so to speak, and saying, we're genocidal maniacs.
Well, if they're coming out and saying it themselves, then history definitely will write this down as a genocide. If they're just saying this openly, that we take polls, we want to kill them all. That's so crazy. I mean, has there ever been anything historical where a population was on board with just killing a whole set of people? I'm sure there has been, right?
I think you certainly can find that in ancient history. I mean, certainly rulers back then were quite open about their genocidal wars.
Ancient history, but
right. But not in modern history. Not in the last. Everybody points to the Germans in World War II. But that whatever the Nazis did, and some of it I think can be described as genocidal. No question about it. There's it wasn't live streamed, and most Germans weren't aware of it. It's something different. This time It wasn't because of just sort of a demand on the pressure from below to do this. Actually, you have pressure from below to go ahead with a genocide. And I don't think that we have anything within, the last couple of centuries, or even, any time during the modern era. Maybe you have to go back to ancient times to find something like that. I don't claim to have done a careful survey, but, to my mind, I can't think of anything in the last several centuries like that.
How do you fix a problem like this if you have the majority, what do you say, 86% of the population that is for ethnic cleansing? This is on a poll, I can't believe it. And then nearly half of them just support just killing them outright, not even trying to displace them. How can what future can that society have? How can that population heal? I mean, the solution isn't to kill those people either, right? I mean, I don't want anybody to die, but I mean, if you have a group of people that are just set on like their ideologies, we need to kill these people, then how do you solve that problem? Like if your neighbor is just like, I'm going to kill you every single day, that can't work, right?
Right. Well, I think it's like if there's any country that can turn this around, it's the United States, because Israel really is very, very dependent on the United States and couldn't even be continuing. We've talked about Iran. There's no way they can even attack Iran in any significant way without American support. But they couldn't have done what they have done already in Gaza without continual U.S. support. And they can't continue with their genocidal campaign there without U.S. support. And if that U.S. support is withdrawn, and in a not just in a very significant way, not another bullet, that's it. Then all of a sudden, Israel would find itself in a whole new world and say, we've made enemies of all the people around us. And actually, we cannot defend ourselves anymore. We need to bury the hatchet. And now it's going to be tough because you have these crazies, I think, who just wouldn't even be able to accept that. But maybe, a good percentage of the the Israeli population would wake up and say, okay, let's talk. Maybe we did go overboard. Okay, we have to pursue a different policy. Well, it could lead to different outcomes. I think it would probably lead to a huge exodus from Israel, from the sane people. And then you would have a small group of crazies, but then those crazies could lose a war. That's if they don't have U.S. support. But, that's just not happening now, unfortunately. But maybe, again, because we are seeing something of a sea change within Western populations, and especially among the younger generation. Maybe, at some time, I think almost inevitably, I should say more than maybe, sometime in the future, there will be a withdrawal, a significant lessening, and then a withdrawal of U.S. support. And then Israel will have to change course. Now, it may not be able to do it successfully. It may be, again, like I said, like half the population just gets out there and the crazies are left, and then you have a terrible war. But that would be a war that they would lose, I think, if, without U.S. support.
Wow. I'm not too surprised to see, Western Europe and the United States still stand with Israel this far. I am clearly, obviously, very disappointed that they've, despite everything over the past 19 months, they were just starting to see a little sign of tone change. But I am a little bit surprised that the rest of the world hasn't done anything. Are you? Did you expect that the Arab countries would have just stood by while this happened, or we wouldn't have seen pressure from large players like Brazil, Russia, China, India?
Right. Well, okay. Yeah. Again, we've talked about the Arabs, and the Arab countries, the Arab governments are kind of like the European governments. They're just saying that, okay, they're starting to feel some pressure from below. And so we've got to say these things. And you see that from a lot of these Arab governments too. We need to, because our people are really angry. Now we just want to it's not in our material interest to have a war with with Israel. We don't give a damn about the Palestinians. Unfortunately, I think that's just the truth of these leaders of the Gulf monarchies and of Egypt and Turkey too. Erdogan. It's a very sad truth, but that's what's going on there. And then as for other countries, well, like Russia is involved in an existential war of its own. And the thing is, like, if Russia became involved directly in a really meaningful way, in a war against Israel, then it could find itself facing, or in a war against the U.S. It could be kind of quickly develop into that. They've got to think about that. The consequences could be enormous, for them. And I know this is I think too that, okay, there is this principle, which I think really needs to be held to. And sometimes it's hard to, but if it's a mistake to ask your own citizens to go and die, for another country. You may be able to do it in the short, but in the long run, it's not your country. And again, you cannot keep those commitments. And like the U.S. and Vietnam is one example. Again, it was thought it was going to be quick and that we would drive back the communists. This was our cause. But then it's when tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers were being killed, there's the Americans soured on it. You say, it's just that this is not our country. This is thousands of miles away. Maybe there was a good reason to do it, but we just can't support that. And I think it would be true for any country, because this, again, Israel has at least 200 nuclear weapons. It's supported by the U.S. If you become involved directly, that's something you're going to have to face. And again, if you're not close to it, you're not within the region, you're asking your citizens to go fight a war that, it may be very worthy. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be, but it's a war that's thousands and thousands of miles away, and asking them to die for this. And I think that that's always a mistake. Now, it should be the Arabs themselves that are doing something. And the one country, of course, is Yemen. These are their brothers. They're not, Palestine is not thousands of miles away. They're connected by blood and by religion, and they're in the same region. And so I think it is proper, and they're willing to do it. And they have suffered terrible consequences, right, for doing it. But I think the Yemenis understand these are our brothers and sisters, and we have to stand by them. Now, I think there are a lot of other people in the region that, look up to them and would like to do the same thing, would like their governments to pursue the same policy, but we have these very corrupt governments.
Yeah, I'm not even necessarily talking about a military intervention, though, but just, for example, forcing in some humanitarian aid. I think that would go real popular. I mean, it doesn't even have to be an altruistic act. Just to know that you will be going down on the right side of history. You think that some countries would do this, that you would force in a flotilla of aid, of medicine, life-saving medicine, and baby formula and food. Who can be so upset at this? We're not talking about bringing in soldiers, there were some clips going around of Chinese jets airdropping food into Gaza. It's fake. As far as I know, but I saw that going around a lot, and people were like, yay, great, thank you, China. Everybody wants to see this happen. Right. That's why those things are going viral. It's like, surely somebody could do something. Can't we just drop food onto this captive population that's being bombed and starved to death? Like, that's, or just have a policy. Isn't there an obligation with the Genocide Convention or whatever to stop something like this?
Yeah.
There's an obligation to do it, to say, as a state like Russia or China, sorry, we don't do trade with states that are engaged in genocide. That should be simple to do. That shouldn't trigger a nuclear war or drumming up support from your citizens. Everybody in every country around the world should be on board with that, would be proud of their country for saying, yes, thank you, our government for taking a stand, a little bit of a stand. Right. You're not asking us to go over and fight, but you're saying don't trade with a state that's doing genocide. Don't force in aid, feed these people.
Yeah. No, I agree, especially the economic sanctions. That is something that countries could do. And a few of them, have. But And of course, the Yemenis have done the most because they are actually enforcing a kind of blockade an economic blockade on Israel. Now, there are countries that could really have an impact on Israel, and one of them is Turkey. They could cut the flow of oil that's passing through that pipeline. It starts in Baku and Azerbaijan, passes through Turkey it ends up in Israel. They could cut that, and that would have an enormous impact. And of course, the Israelis do a lot of trade with Europe. As the Europeans got serious and said, okay, economic sanctions on Israel, this has just gone too far. They've rolled out their 17th package, and they're working on their 18th for Russia, but they can't do one for Israel. But if they did it, it would have a huge impact, much more of an impact than these 17 or 18 packages directed against Russia, which have had very little impact. Israel is a much smaller country. And again, I think much more dependent on European trade. And then, of course, the U.S., the impact would be enormous. Then that's something that it could do, without direct military intervention. Now, some of these humanitarian interventions that you're talking about, it's hard to prevent those from turning into military conflict. For example, if you, in fact, I think you're right that that's phony, the Chinese planes flying over Gaza. But if they did that, those planes could be shot down, and then we could have, a large conflict or an attempt to even bring in aid by boat. The Israelis would attack it. They've attacked them in the past, and they could. And if you're going to defend the boat, then you have a true military conflict, which could spiral out of control. So that's a little bit more difficult. But the economic sanctions could be done, and I think you're right, should be done.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've talked a lot about this, how military power, economic power, soft power, these are kind of like these three pillars of Western hegemony, and they've all been knocked down. And so we're having these power vacuums, essentially, that is occurring around the world. I think the military power vacuum is being largely filled by Russia, showing that this is becoming the new military superpower. There's not a single dominant hyperpower like we thought we had before, but we're seeing, okay, this is where a lot of military power is. Economic power, I think everybody is pretty clear that it's within BRICS, primarily China, that is filling that economic power. But then there's still this sort of vacuum in terms of the third one, which is the soft power, the moral power. And what we have here in Gaza has destroyed the moral power, the soft power of the West, but is creating a huge opportunity for some country to absorb some of that moral power, by being on the right side of history. So even just from a strategic point, from a country like China, taking a stance on this will all of a sudden solidify, it's got great military power, fantastic economic power. This would give a huge boost to its moral power, its soft power, which I think we've talked about before, is incredibly important, perhaps the most important one. It allows you to be the good people, the on the side of good. And I'm just surprised that other countries haven't taken, even just from that opportunistic lens, that move. Because what we've seen, for example, now is Yemen. Nobody knew about Yemen, cared about it, even while it was being bombed nonstop by Saudi Arabia with our backing. Nobody knew about it. But now Yemen has become a moral superpower. Iran as well. People always had kind of a negative view of Iran. But now, because it's kind of the head of the axis of resistance and supporting Yemen, it is establishing itself as a moral superpower. I think Professor Morandi, I was listening the other day, was saying that, just how Iran has become popular. He goes places and people are like, oh, we love Iran. Something you wouldn't really hear years ago. So it just, it's just surprising to me that I'm disappointing and surprising, because I think even just in terms of a calculated self-interested move, it would make sense to put the sanctions on Israel as a country.
Right.
You would become that moral superpower.
Right. I agree.
A country like China did it.
Right.
Wow. Chinese popularity, boom, out the roof,
Right. No, I agree. Maybe there's something that I'm not seeing. There's some reason that these countries are reluctant to do it. But I find your argument very convincing.